kind of shirts. Thanks, honey. Plus, he's better at it.
Doing it right now.
Eric, good to see you. Good to see you.
Oh my gosh.
Glad you can make it. Well, I mean, come on. Like I said, how long?
Should I get a picture of you?
Yeah, she's doing. Clara Severstein joined.
Perfect.
Hello, Clara.
Oh no, I thought at the monster.
I am holding the live stream camera on Eric Paulson.
Out there on the street. Before we start, should I get a picture of us, please?
Well, we're good enough. We're good enough. No, I think there were a couple of while.
Should I on the camera feel like I'm pitching it?
Oh, I think that could be funny. Do the side one too.
I was pinching it.
Oh, this is my husband.
Good afternoon.
I thought he went to get a beer right before we walked
No,
on.
I didn't think of that.
She's having him video.
No, I haven't seen it.
What's his name again? My pillow.
Almost 1 o'clock. We have 6 viewers right now.
Yes, there is.
Watching live.
Is there sound?
I don't know. Send me a comment if you can hear me talking to you.
Yeah.
Hello, Jenna Martin.
Oh, here we go.
Oh, there's a question mark after it. I know. I know it's not that one, but it just came from the
Oh, really? Oh. Yeah, but you get to do farm animals tomorrow. Oh, you got that? Yeah. I won't put it on. It's like I came in your first. Oh. No, I won't. You guys are good enough.
This here one.
All right.
You are welcome, Linda. Thank you for viewing. That's my mom.
Welcome, Representative Paulson.
Great to be with you.
Thank you for showing up.
It's always good at the fair.
Fair days are always good days, and we got a let up in the rain, so happy for that. I know we only had it for a limited amount of time, so I want to get right to it. Let's talk about taxes, because that's the next big topic coming down the pike in Congress, and I know there is growing consensus around what National Economic Director Gary Cohn has called the skeleton of a plan that apparently includes some things to help finance tax cuts, which include a cap eliminate a cap on mortgage interest deductions and elimination of the deductibility of state and local taxes. Tell us where you are on those two.
Yeah, and first of all, I should mention that for the whole month of August, I've been out talking about tax reform. It's been 31 years since we've had major tax overhaul with Ronald Reagan, with Democratic Congress, which is a long period of time. And so we think it's really important for the country, for the economy. No one is defending the status quo. And so there are these significant changes coming. International tax reform, competitiveness for large employers, small business, and then some of those deductions, as you mentioned, as the blueprint is unfolded in the House. And I know that the administration and the Senate have also been engaged. The principals are meeting kind of on a weekly and even daily basis. They're starting to iron out some of those details. I think they'll crystallize a little bit more in September. We have talked about having a higher standard deduction that would offset maybe changes that are made in mortgage deduction. We're keeping that.
But will it be capped?
It actually could be capped at some level of some sort.
And do you tell us a little bit about why you think that's a smart way to go? I know there are people who are for and against it.
Sure.
And there are reasons on both sides.
Sure. Well, and I think one of the challenges we've had is how do you best make sure you've got a provision in the tax code that allows home ownership, especially for lower income folks or moderate income folks. Right now, you can have a second home. It's kind of uncapped for the most part. And so does it make sense to have lower rates, but then just have a cap at some level? So you still reap a benefit within the tax code or incentive for home ownership, but you've got a little more simplicity because not as many people would be itemizing.
Right, so you're seeing that as something that would affect, higher
upper income folks, mostly obviously, or folks that have a second home,
homes,
maybe,
right.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, and then with that would come perhaps a higher standard deduction that might compensate for a little bit of that, fewer people itemize.
Exactly, because today about a third of people itemize on their taxes. Right. The blueprint, the way it's been set up, they estimate about 95% of folks would not itemize any longer because it'd be as simple as a postcard. Keep charitable deduction, keep a home deduction, higher education, retirement provisions, and then clear out a lot of the other clutter.
And then what about elimination of deductibility for state and local taxes, especially in a higher tax state like Minnesota?
Yeah,
that's something to really consider.
Right, absolutely, and I'm looking at that, and we have not had any discussions yet about eliminating that or capping those deductions. But I would anticipate this fall that may come up because New York, Minnesota, California would be some of those states. So I've got concerns about that, and I would want to make sure that there are any deductions, or the standard deduction would offset potentially any impact that it might have on someone who's using their current state or local deduction, as an example. And we also want to make sure property taxes are included as a part of that. We've talked about including that as a part of the mortgage deduction as well for homeowners.
Okay, so that would be another way that people could sort of recoup a little bit of that.
Exactly.
And would you consider voting for a tax bill that might possibly grow the short or long-term deficit, because there's not a lot of extra revenue lying around?
Right. I think the key principle that we should embark on, that I've been talking about when we talk about tax reform, knowing it only happens once in a generation, we should build it on growth and really focus on growth. So do better than 1.5%, 2% GDP. So try to get to 3%, 3.5%. And so getting to that is better. But in order to do that, we also have to have permanency in the code.
Kind of betting on the come a little bit, right? Given our last few years.
But revenue neutrality is important. So I think we should be revenue neutral in any approach we do and how it's scored. And that allows us to have long-term permanency in the code rather than, like the Bush tax cuts, they all expired after a certain period of time. So a lot of folks that, whether you're a small business or a large company, they were always wondering or second guessing, is Congress going to renew these tax cuts? That's no different than just cutting a couple percentages off a rate and calling it a day.
And that's not good for taxes because you need stability.
You need stability, and you want to make sure, and revenue growth does solve other problems. Whether it's a deficit, the national debt, it helps with spending priorities, it helps.
So just to make sure that we're clear for people who might not follow this as closely as you do, when you say revenue neutral, You mean that it can't really grow beyond, you wouldn't want to go into a deficit.
Right,
or
then it
add
would be
to the
scored to say it's not going to have a deficit, exactly.
All right, very good. I know that there are a lot of people anxious to hear about this because it is the single most asked question I've gotten in advance of this visit, and that is the subject of town halls, public meetings where people can be, can have access to ask questions. I know you've done telephone town halls, you've done meetings in your district. How do you publicize those? How far in advance? And will you commit to having a town hall in advance of your meeting?
So here's what I do right now. We've had 7 telephone town halls, which are very popular. People like them. I'll be in a Target or a
No, they're
Home
not.
Depot, and people say, when are you doing your next telephone call? And so those are very, we use those as much as possible. We can't do them every week, but we try to do them periodically.
But could you not build in-person ones as well? Because I've heard some, frustrations about telephone town halls and the lottery that it gets picked to ask a question. There's something about being able to go to a school or an auditorium and, at least see you. And I have to say, a lot of the people who have asked me this question have been very respectful. They say, they want to just be able to hear from you directly.
Right, and so the other thing we do is we have Congress on Your Corner events. I did 8 of those last year. We had 2 this last week.
And how do you publicize those?
We do a mailing to the community and make sure they show up for folks. And
like actual snail mail?
Yeah.
You put it out on your website or anything?
Well, we won't put it on the website, so like you get 100 people lining up at a library or at a club when you're only there for an hour and a half.
Right.
But we just did the last couple we did. People love it because they're just like, oh, I'm going to bring up this issue, and they'll talk about Social Security or health care or taxes. And then I also do open office hours, so anyone can go online, pick a time or sign up for. I've met with a lot of folks we see here even that I recognize some faces, and have spent individual time with those folks. And a lot of members of Congress don't do that, but I've done well over 100 of those. Dozens of folks that don't agree on positions, and listening to every perspective is helpful, obviously. And so we did that this week.
Why do you think there's so much frustration then built up over this particular issue? I know that. Not to compare you to your brethren, but Representative Tom Emmer has held several town halls, and I get emails of them. They're up on his website. What's wrong with that approach?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, Emmer did do one earlier on, and what we want to avoid is sort of a spectacle of folks that shout over other people. Kind of, we had a little bit of that here. I mean, people can sort of understand that.
Yeah, but democracy is messy. Doesn't that kind of come with the territory? And I'm sure you have security people. I know there have to be concerns.
Well, we don't want to have security. Hopefully in Minnesota, I mean, we've seen a little bit of uncivil activity, but we don't want to have that.
But isn't that better than not having access at all?
Well, actually, that's why we have full access. Whether you want a private meeting, whether you want to come to a bench on your corner, whether you telephone town hall, FaceTime Live, we've done a lot of those different events, and we'll continue to do that. So the standard is being accessible.
Should we expect some kind of an in-person public town hall from you between now and Election Day?
I wouldn't close the door to it at all by any means.
But you're also not committing to it.
Well, not committing to how we would do it necessarily for someone else's standards, but would not close the door to it.
All right. Let's go to healthcare, because I think that's another topic that weighs heavy on people's minds. There's been a lot of controversy about it. Nobody is happy with the way things are going. One of the things that was in the House Health Bill was capping Medicaid for the first time in its history, and eventually block granting it. What's the justification for that when it actually costs demonstrably less to insure these people on Medicaid than it does through private insurers?
Yeah. So some of the challenges we've had, as you mentioned, no one is happy. So this is clearly the single most issue I have heard from folks about. Easily way lopsided, got to do with the Affordable Care Act because it's causing a lot of problems, whether it's higher insurance rates or higher deductibles or just even access to a simple doctor that folks have come to rely on as a part of their personal care. The Medicaid component that a lot of states use to supplement their own health care dollars was used primarily for helping single able-bodied individuals. So states like Minnesota use disabled dollars in Medicare or those in poverty, and we should continue to do those things.
But the reality is that most of those people that you refer to as able-bodied are often poor, have multiple chronic illnesses.
Some are, yes.
Right,
some are.
So what do you do about them? What's the plan to cover them once the cap runs out?
Well, part of it is, I think everyone would also acknowledge that these dollars aren't going to continue forever. I mean, at the federal government level. I mean, folks have said they know it's not sustainable. It started at 100%, it's gone down to 90%. Democrats would tell you they don't expect that to keep going up. And so you do have to have some sort of a payment mechanism to make sure those dollars are able to flow, which is why block grants have been discussed, or making sure that states have flexibility. I mean, I'm working right now as the lead in the House to make sure we get our waiver as the governor and the legislature passed for a reinsurance program. I put another call in yesterday to the administration. Hopefully we get that, because that is meeting our state's needs, but we have to have a waiver to do that. And I think more state waivers is the way to go, rather than a one-size-fits-all for everybody.
I think the average person is probably going to have a little difficulty understanding why Medicaid, if we can't afford to cover the poorest Americans, how can we afford tax cuts?
Well, and the average person also would say, why are my premiums going up 20, 30, 80%, right? We were fourth highest in the country last year for our premiums going up. And I can't cover my family, right? I have ministers contact me who say this is really hurting our situation, cancer patients. So it's not just about the numbers, it's about the people that it's impacting and trying to be helpful. And I mean, I personally don't think any one party has a monopoly on ideas in this space. Just like the Democrats pass it on a party line vote, don't see what's in it. I don't subscribe to the fact that it has to be a Republican-only answer solution. I'd like to sort of Minnesota-tizing the conversation around this, because Ron Kind and I, who's a Democrat from Wisconsin, we do initiatives together for chronic care management, for obesity, for a number of these areas. And so you got a Green Bay Packer fan, Viking fan working together. Democrats and Republicans can do this also.
That's always
and
good.
We should do that.
Does that mean that it's time to be done with the whole repeal and replace, and let's just work on fixing what's there instead of wasting more time?
I think we should be fixing what's there.
Yeah.
People expect.
Thank you.
And keep provisions like young people on their parents' policies for age 26, not having lifetime caps, for instance, pre-existing conditions, those things. Some of my colleagues think the federal government should have no role in health care. I don't believe that's the case. I think, one, we've crossed that bridge. Two, the public doesn't expect that any longer. And states need also freedom to be able to do what they need to do to help their own populations more.
I wanted to ask you about that freedom question, because I noticed that Speaker Ryan framed that in the terms of the individual mandate, saying that people need to be free, not to have health care. Is that really a freedom? Because, people choose that because they think ultimately, well, someone's going to take care of this. They're not just going to let me die. They wind up on Medicaid, or they wind up at the emergency room. So all they're really doing is betting that everybody else will come in, charity care. Don't we need to be grown-ups about this and say, you know what, there has to be some kind of insurance?
Yeah, and this is where some Republicans have even in the past have advocated for an individual mandate. And certainly,
it was originally a Republican idea from Mitt Romney.
Exactly. And I'm not a fan of it. I think we saw that it didn't work because we had 10 million new people sign up under Obamacare, and then 19.5 million said, well, I'm not going to sign up, I'll pay the penalty.
That's because the penalty was watered down, though.
Well,
right?
And so
there were reasons why the mandate didn't succeed.
And so it's sort of fundamental, what sort of penalty do you want to put on people, or should the federal government impose that penalty versus incentivizing more care, whether it's more opportunity to actually lower costs, right? And I do think there are a lot of models that we should be looking at for value-based healthcare, where the provider is working with even a company like a Medtronic, that wants to move into caring about healthcare outcomes and take the risk and also take the reward. If outcomes improve, they can get paid more. If they don't improve, they get paid less. And that'll change the discussion a little bit too. I think where we'll have coverage more accessible for a lot more folks, especially younger people that want to be covered for catastrophic insurance. So there's some new ideas we should absolutely be looking at.
So do you anticipate that there will be some kind of a coalition consensus plan between Republicans and Democrats out of this Congress?
My advice, and I've talked to the Speaker, I've talked to leadership on my committee, I've said the best thing we can do is allow a governing majority within the House. You can't say what the Senate will or won't do, but
that's the Senate.
I think we should have a governing majority that puts ideas up on the floor and moves them through for a vote. Colin Peterson is another example. He's a Democrat who didn't support the law. He wants to go back to the way some of the things were, but make some fixes. So there's opportunity across the aisle.
Speaking about the Senate, you had a piece in our editorial page today, a commentary on what you call the stalling of the nomination of David Strauss, a Minnesota Supreme Court justice who is now up for a federal judgeship. Talk to us a little bit about how you see that as different from what happened with Merrick Garland, the Obama nominee for the U.S. Supreme Court, who never even got a hearing and the hundreds of appointees that either got slow walked or blocked by Republicans. Why was that okay then, not okay now? Tell us about that.
And just give a little background. So, Justice Strauss, who has been nominated, is one of our Minnesota Supreme Court justices, has been nominated for the 8th Circuit. Has been announced actually by the ABA as receiving sort of the highest qualified, well-qualified. The Star Tribune itself said he's earned the nomination, right?
As we thought Merrick Garland had.
Right. And so I think now, for me as a House member, this is more about making sure Minnesota gets its person there, because the 8th Circuit includes states like Missouri, North Dakota, and Nebraska, and we had a Minnesota retire from that seat, and quite honestly, if we don't act quickly or prudently, we will lose that Minnesota seat. It could go to a Missouri person instead, and so I know there are senators from Missouri and other states that want to take that Minnesota seat back. It was negotiated way back in the Reagan years, but they want to fight for it. So it's more about fighting for a really good justice that has broad support, including from his colleagues that are on the opposite, on a lot of issues. Justice Strauss is an independent thinker. He's sided with Alan Page on a lot of dissents, concurring motions, as well as rulings on the majority side. And we want independent thinkers. I think that's really critical. And on the Supreme Court side, I don't disagree that a lot of that has turned into a partisan animal over the last few years. Do we
have to end that at some point?
Both sides are to blame on that. Even when the Democrats took away the nuclear option for Supreme Court, it kind of started us down that road where we ended up with some other judges getting approved without that filibuster rule too. So both sides are guilty of that. But I want to make sure from a Minnesota perspective, we get one of the best legal minds on the court. And it's no different. I work with Amy Klobuchar on a lot of issues across the aisle. We do. Human trafficking, medical device tax repeal. And when she called me 2 years ago, when Justice Wright, who's also Supreme Court Justice from Minnesota, for a federal judgeship, she asked me to meet with her, and I did. I thought she was well qualified. This was under President Obama. And I also put a phone call into Senator Grassley, who's on the Judiciary Committee, to help move that forward. And so we should be working the same, I think, in this instance, knowing the administration goes back and forth, and fill our judicial vacancies.
What about the still open seat for the U.S. Attorney? We haven't had anybody since Andy Lugar got pink slipped. What happens on that front?
Well, we need to move forward on that too. Quite honestly, there have not been any nominations, that have come out of the White House. I know that Senator Klobuchar and Senator Franken have had their own sort of selection process move forward. They haven't included us in that. So I think we're waiting to hear on the U.S. Attorney, the U.S. Marshal. We also have 2 federal district court positions that are open right now that we want to see filled. And there's more of an emergency along those, to be honest, because those are also, we have a backlog in our district courts. And those are the cases that in turn go up to the circuit court, where Justice Strauss would be, or hope to be.
I also wanted to make sure that in light of the president's recent remarks where he actually threatened a government shutdown if the wall wasn't approved, what are your thoughts on that? That is something that could be coming up very soon. It wasn't just a one-off. He's been saying it. Do you support that, or would you block it?
Well, I certainly wouldn't support that. I think it's foolish to have a conversation or even talk about a government shutdown, and why the president himself would do that kind of blows me away. And it's certainly not the approach that I would take. Look, the appropriations process is going to go forward, and there are provisions, and I'm not a big fan of the wall myself. I think there are much more smarter allocations of how dollars are spent with technology along the border, and the border agents would tell you that actually from an enforcement perspective.
Visa overstays, that's the biggest source.
Sure, and this goes back to whole immigration policy and fixing that, which I think should absolutely be a focus. So some of it is sort of the bluster I think we just have come to realize or deal with, but I think our appropriators are just going to go through their process, and I don't think anyone will want to be in a position of having a shutdown like we've had in the past. Nobody wins in the public, nobody wins from a political perspective as either party from being in charge. That's not smart.
This is a slightly related question, still on immigration, but I wanted to get your thoughts on the immigration reform proposal that he trotted out. The wall deals with illegal immigration, but now he's announced that he wants curbs on legal immigration. And in a state like Minnesota, where we are starved for workers, I've had companies tell me that they're really concerned about being able to recruit top candidates. What have you been hearing? What are your thoughts on that?
I've been hearing from a lot of the companies. I've been to a whole host of small businesses and large employers actually in the last couple of weeks. Not only talking about tax reform, but a workforce, having a workforce to fill jobs that are really critical to their success and growth. And it's probably the number 2 concern that I actually hear from them about.
Farmers. I've heard a lot from
Number 1
farmers
and
who
2.
are concerned.
So, I mean, I actually really do believe we need to make progress in immigration reform here, actually, so labor follows capital. I'm not at citizenship, but legal status should be there so people can work, they can be here, address those needs, and also reverse, I think, some of the indications we've had lately with the way the current immigration system is set up, where it's mostly based on family connections as opposed to skill-based needs, whether you're knowledge, it's a knowledge worker or it's a low-skilled worker that works in agriculture, like you mentioned, or at a restaurant. We need to have that filled either way, whatever visa that may be. We should have an artificial cap or a quota on visas.
And I thought, don't you think? I mean, by skills, you have to be looking at a broad range of skill sets, not just Nobel Prize winners and Olympic athletes. I think, as was cited before, but the farmer that needs his crops
got to pick the crops, got to have workers in the restaurant at whatever level that is. And just like from an American entrepreneurial immigrant's perspective, you work your way up, you do well for your family, and that's part of the success of the American dream.
I wanted to make sure that we could get at least 1 or 2 questions from the crowd. So if someone, and please be respectful, has a question they want to ask the congressman.
I'll be respectful, I promise. Thank you, Patricia, for covering the town halls. I think you've realized, Eric, we are not we're trying to be as respectful as possible with being in disagreement. Yeah, so why did it take you 10 days to go to a location in your district that had been bombed, a mosque? Why did it take you 10 days to get there? I know you were on vacation, but Governor Dayton was there, Representative Ellison was there.
The question is, why did it take the congressman a certain amount of time to get to the mosque that had been bombed?
Yeah, well, I was out of town actually in the backcountry, back hiking with my family. So we were in Utah at Zion National Park, and I did learn a couple of days later that this had taken place. And we set up a meeting and a visit as soon as we could. Went out there and visited, and I'll actually be able to return because now we're going to be working with them on the charter school that they have. I co-chair the charter school caucus. And so we had a good visit, left some flowers there, our sympathies. The entire community pulled together at an event that would take place like that in Minnesota. It was like a huge shock to the system, I think, for a lot of folks. So, blessings come out of instances like that because the community has rallied around the folks at the Islamic Center, and now we've got even a stronger relationship as we've been going out and working with them. And we will, I think, follow up on the charter school opportunity too.
That's good to know, because I was going to ask you, particularly in the wake of Charlottesville, and you did denounce the white supremacists in no uncertain terms, and I think everybody in Minnesota welcomes that. But what happens now? I mean, when we continue to have very troubling incidents here. A swastika was carved into a golf course in Lakeville. We had any number of incidents from St. Cloud, all over the state. What concrete action do you see yourself being able to take to address this?
A couple things. One, I think we all have to be vigilant in opposition right away, right up front, as soon as possible. And the community, I think, is rallying in general on that. And also respect civility, discourse, restraint, whether it's in the political system or in society as a whole. I mean, my roommate was also shot and is still recovering, and a lot of that was generated by social media. And so there are a lot of challenges, I think, for how people react to issues that happen. And, you have to kind of keep those things in check and have your voice heard, but at the same time, respect those who are there and have. So there are some challenges there. And so I think we're looking for ideas, and right when we get back, I think after Labor Day, when Congress returns, we'll probably look at some of these instances that have happened during the district work period, and we'll be hearing from our colleagues about what else we should be doing, and pushing the administration to be more aggressive.
Well, and on that front, what responsibility does President Trump have for fanning this kind of anger? We had sort of the multiple takes at addressing Charlottesville.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a responsibility where, it's so easy to denounce and say there's no moral equivalency between the two sides. You should do that right away. And anytime you do rallies that are in the campaign style, it makes it much more challenging, I think, when folks get, they row up in really heated rhetoric, and you should try and tone that down. And, I think people are looking for statesmen, they're looking for leadership, at the sort of that statesman presidential leadership, and he's more of a disruptor in that category, certainly.
Yes?
Certainly.
You have a question?
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about Charlottesville. I mean, we all saw President Trump's response to the events that happened there. And
a little closer so I can hear your question.
Sure. We all saw President Trump's response to the events in Charlottesville. Do you think that he still has the moral authority to govern us? How can you support him after his lackluster response to those events.
Okay, so the question is, after Charlottesville and everything that led up to that, does President Trump still have the moral authority to govern us?
Well, I think folks are looking for a moral compass from everybody who's in leadership. So, I don't think you can just say, well, does he have the moral authority? I mean, he's been elected under his own right, obviously, but, there's a check and a balance, and it's up to whether it's the judicial system, the legislative check that we have, oversight, which is critical, the independent counsel, Mueller, who's looking at possible ties to Russia, which the intelligence community has backed up. All those things need to run their course. Facts matter, words matter. And we need to understand it. I think the president needs to understand also, my message would be, if you want to be successful on tax reform, getting some of these things that are important for your agenda across the finish line, you've got to have the ability to lead and get public support or galvanize that type of support to be successful. And that's what I think we're going to have to focus on.
Anyone else? You, sir.
Would you be willing to impeach Donald Trump to vote for impeachment?
Sorry, could you say
Would you be willing to vote for impeaching Donald Trump if the evidence points in that direction?
The question is whether Representative Paulson would be willing to vote to impeach the president if evidence points in that direction.
Well, if Robert Mueller, for instance, came back and said there are criminal violations or liabilities, certainly, because under the clause, no matter who is president or who's in charge, would be under that situation.
I have a question on the bill that is before both houses of Congress to create congressional oversight, a declaration of war before a nuclear first strike, and that's an issue in current right now. Would you support that?
Okay, the question is whether or not to support a bill that would require congressional oversight before a nuclear first strike. And this comes on the heels of the sanctions bill in which Congress told the president, I think for the first time, that they would have to come to Congress before lifting the sanctions on Russia.
Yeah, so first of all, we approved those sanctions.
Yes, and you voted for that.
Absolutely, and I wish we would have acted sooner. I know that once the Senate passed those, there was a resistance from the administration to alter the version, and we were able to successfully, almost unanimously actually, just move in the right direction, which is very important. So I'm not familiar with that exact bill. I would never want to tie the hands of whoever's in charge from making the appropriate decisions with our military leaders based on a situation, but I'll look at whatever that bill is or check into it when we get back. So.
First of all, I do want to say thank you for meeting with Moms Demand Action. I was part of that group.
Could you speak up just a little, please?
I met with Representative Paulson with Moms Demand Action on the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act.
I'm sorry, I cannot hear you. Can you maybe step over the bench so we can hear the question?
Loud.
I met with Representative Paulson about the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act of Moms Demand Action, which I appreciate your meeting with us. We were unable to get a commitment to oppose the bill. It's a very dangerous bill in Congress right now. And so I'm wondering if you've thought about that some more in terms of any decisions on that, because a lot of Keith Ellison has opposed it and several others have come out opposing it.
Did you hear that?
Yeah, I did. So we had a group of folks come in and moms come in who were talking about a bill that would allow automatic reciprocity on concealed carry between different states. And this was just 2 days ago, so part of the office hours that we had. And I said that I wanted to talk to the bill author to find out exactly what he was trying to get at, and I would look at the bill when we got back right after Labor Day. So we haven't had a chance to do that, obviously, yet, but we'll have to look at it. So I haven't done anything in the last 2 days, I guess.
But it's been out there for a very long time, so I was surprised
you guys,
that you didn't know more about it.
Yeah. And she raised with me, when the group came and met with me, I hadn't heard of it yet until they came in. But.
I did want to ask you, in the wake of the shooting at the baseball field, every time these things happen, there's this outcry, is it finally time to take, a look at some kind of safeguards against the proliferation of guns? We've had people shot downtown. It's just, if you ever look at a ShotSpotter map of Minneapolis, it's pretty frightening. And can't we strike some kind of balance? No right is absolute between this, that respects the Second Amendment, but still takes into greater consideration people's right to be safe.
Sure. Right. Well, and obviously, Second Amendment is a constitutional right. As the moms who came in and met with me say, they support the Second Amendment as well. And there have been some court cases at the Supreme Court level, just even within the last few years, addressing some of those issues, actually. So I think we should always be reviewing those based on maybe whether it's a tragedy or just the facts on the ground of what presents needs for different safety changes. One thing I did support that I think is very important as a part of the National Criminal Background Check is putting more dollars into those resources because that is a law, but states collect all that information. We've been woefully behind actually in collecting that data because the folks that make the decisions, you want to make sure that the data is there, or they have a tougher time actually making a decision.
And how is that effort going? Because that actually sounds meaningful.
Yeah, and it's actually catching up. I've heard that some states like Minnesota, now and I've been in touch with Sheriff Sanic and Hennepin County and others, so law enforcement's a big counselor to me on some of these issues. I do a round table with them periodically, and I follow their guidance. So I think we are making progress, as well as looking at avenues for more judicial restraint for people with mental health issues, things like that.
That seems to be, there seems to be some ability to create common ground around that issue of mental health.
Right.
You feel that's something you can endorse? I
do, and I think we started that last year when we had the 21st Century Cures Act that was passed. It included important provisions for revisions in federal mental health care programs that I think starts us down that road. And we have one leader in Congress who's a psychologist with his background, and he's been urging the conference to pay attention to those types of issues, and we're making headway now on a bipartisan basis.
I wanted to ask you too about something that's been an issue you've worked on for a long time, and that's human trafficking. And I think we've seen more instances, not just of sex trafficking, but of, it's pretty close to what you might call enslavement, people that take advantage of workers. Talk to us about both those fronts. How bad do you think the problem is in Minnesota, and what can realistically be done about it?
It's still a problem in Minnesota because even when we've been successful in passing some new laws, and Senator Klobuchar and I did the safe harbor provisions that were great in providing victims support services, so you're not prosecuted as a young juvenile, for instance, for alcohol, drugs, prostitution. Those are critical. I think we need to do more now to make sure that criminal records can be expunged if they were in a trafficking situation, for instance, because these are folks that are trying to get back on their feet, get housing, get a job, and we should allow that to move forward. So there's some new things we're doing actually in that area. There's plenty of room, and the good news is it's very bipartisan. It's some of the most meaningful work that I've been able to work on because it literally is about saving lives, and it's not just 12 and 13, 14-year-old girls. It's young boys too,
right.
And the labor
it's not
component.
Just children. It's adults. I think a lot of it are undocumented immigrants who come here on fake visas. They say they're here on a tourist visa, and actually they've been brought here to work.
That's right.
In sex rings and every other kind of work you can imagine.
And I'll just tell you too, I was involved in watching sort of a sting operation take place in the western suburbs with our law enforcement group. This is just a few months ago. They ran an ad on Backpage for a 15-year-old girl, and within an hour and a half, they had 100 hits right in our area on the 494 corridor, which is pretty scary. So it is a problem. It's in every community around the country. It's not just in urban core. It's in rural. It's in the suburbs, and we all need to pay more attention.
The last time I checked, though, it looks as though the president, in the budget that he proposed, would actually defund the account that sets aside money to help those people. Victim services that help either transition them back to a normal life, get them, whatever they need, because they've been heavily victimized by this. Where is that, and is that something that you intend to try to fight for?
I would fight for that, keeping that. We shouldn't have those cuts in those types of areas. And I'll just tell you, when the president submits his budget, it's a little bit no different than when President Obama did. There's wholesale change.
Sure.
And we made significant changes. I was the only Republican in the House that voted for our appropriations bill back in April. But it included more NIH funding, which I think is really critical, building off of our 21st Century Cures model. And we need to move more forward in that direction. The government does have a role and responsibility for basic research for some of those areas. And we need to prioritize spending, absolutely. But we also need, as an example, in the State Department or Foreign Aid or USAID, we need soft power as a part of our democratic consultations with our allies.
Yes, but the emphasis from the administration seems to be on hard power. Right. Have they forgotten about the diplomacy part?
I think they have in some of their approach, which is why the House is reversing that as a part of our appropriations process. So we've restored and actually increased funding in some of those areas.
I need to ask you about trade. You've been a strong voice for trade in the time you've been in Congress. The latest from the president is, and he tossed this off, so who knows how much he means it, about possibly eliminating NAFTA entirely. Now, my understanding is that NAFTA is so completely woven into our economy, that would be kind of catastrophic. Do you see that actually happening? What are your concerns on that front? Can the Congress possibly forestall it if he decides to pull out?
Well, the president has a lot of authority to do different renegotiations or pull out of agreements. And I think some of us in Congress that really do believe in a robust trade agenda and open markets, and knowing that a lot of our jobs in Minnesota, I think it's like 800,000, are tied to trade. They pay higher wages. It is so important. So I have been counter to the administration on many of these provisions. So I think the approach I've taken is that, one, I've started the new Digital Trade Caucus to look at how you modernize NAFTA with e-commerce and digital trade, which didn't exist 20 years ago.
Right.
There's an opportunity.
And clearly it has to be redone to address that.
But we shouldn't have destability. It is so interwoven in our economy. And I think that's what a lot of the ag groups and a lot of exporters are concerned about right now. So I helped push some of the freshmen, including even Jason Lewis, who signed on, to make sure that they were telling the administration, this is also important to new members who were just elected. They sent that letter to the administration saying, don't disrupt what's going on right now. That blustery rhetoric continues. But but Trade Ambassador Lighthizer, he has been meeting with many of us on the Ways and Means Committee on a regular basis, and he is actually accepting of the language in Trans-Pacific Partnership and TTIP to keep some of those provisions. So,
and I know you get more rational voices coming from,
and that's what we need.
That sort of next level. But what power does the president have to just disrupt all that?
Well, he has a lot of power because he's doing it, and you hope that he would just appoint people that are, getting the job done. That's what we'll see, because I think they've announced their goal also is to have the modernization of NAFTA done before year end, before it would impact the Mexican election, for example, next year. They would have that behind us.
I heard that General Mills now gets 40% of his oats for Cheerios from Canada.
Yeah,
so Canada sends down the oats, we make the Cheerios, we sell it back to them, and that's just one of many pieces. So is that something that, Congress, similar to the sanctions, is there any kind of stopgap they can put in there?
The stopgap we have is that for any new trade agreement that is done, the president is bound to the law of trade promotion authorities. So constitutionally, we have the prerogative of directing the administration of what the negotiation goals are. If they deviate from those goals, we can pull the agreement back. That doesn't take away the ability of the president to withdraw from current agreements, which is where the disruption would be. And integrated supply chains are very real, even for companies that are moving back to the United States for a variety of reasons, of lower energy costs, etc. They still have a big supply chain that is connected all over.
Well, given the conversations you've had with Lighthizer, what kind of assurances can you give us that you think that an elimination of NAFTA is not imminent and maybe just go for a modernization?
No, I feel like we're on the modernization track for all the feedback we've had from the people that are in the negotiations themselves. And I think that's the sounding board that I think policymakers are looking for. And I think as we meet almost on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis in the coming months, because we'll have another round in September when these negotiations take place, we need to sit down and make sure we're emphasizing the importance of different provisions. And every different stakeholder in the business and ag community is doing the same thing with letters and reorganizing those types of priorities.
And tell us where you fit into that leadership piece.
Yeah, so before I was even a member of the trade subcommittee, I went to every single trade hearing, and Bill Frenzel, who was one of my predecessors, who I met with coffee before he passed away every 3 months. I miss Bill, but he was one of the people that really guided me as a mentor in trade issues. And so I think Chairman Brady recognizes me as a leader on that, as well as Chairman Riker, who's the trade
Kevin Brady is
chair.
the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee.
Right. Yeah, so I, as much as possible, I just really believe that this is one of the best issues to focus on for Minnesota growth. It's one of the reasons why we weathered the economic storm as well as we did a few years ago.
Are there any other questions? You, sir.
I would like to give you a wonderful opportunity to give me something concrete from this. What I'm looking for is step out of the politician mode, be straight with us. Enough water's gone under the bridge to simply yes or no. Do you support the United States pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords?
Okay, the question is, does he support the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord?
Yeah, no, I thought it was a mistake to pull out.
Thank you.
I think we have time for probably one more. You, sir.
Perfect. Following this question right here. With Minnesota being one of the leaders in renewable energy
Okay, the question is about renewables and whether he supports tax credits and incentives for renewable energy.
Yeah, so having, I think, those options for incentivizing clean renewable sources is absolutely the way to go. Now, the wind folks, for instance, they would say they've already been kind of covered. They're on a glide path down, and you don't want to have anyone that's on a permanent trajectory, but we want to make sure of what works. I would actually like to support an approach that actually does a benchmark or a measure regardless of what the renewable energy might be, but they could get, an incentive regardless of what the implement. Could be hydro, could be wind. That way you're not picking a winner or a loser, but clean, affordable energy from that perspective is absolutely doable. It should be a part of our energy mix going forward. It really should. Well, some of them are, many of them are all they're set to expire at a certain period of time, and some of them just need a better glide path to, for predictability for the folks that do the investments in those areas, for instance.
Congressman, I want to thank you for a really lively and informative conversation. We wanted to give you a little parting gift souvenir from the state fair, so you can take this back to the district.
I was hoping for like a Prono Pup or something. All right, good.
You have to go to a different booth for that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
They're asking that it stays streamed for just a couple minutes after. Lots of positive comments on this one. Okay.
I know I was trying to think of how I can make you mad. Because when you're mad, you're very loud and clear.
Kind of like Trump, and he tweets back everything that.
I texted Dad that question. But see, the thing is his answer doesn't match his goals. That's the problem. It becomes a problem.
I don't know that. It doesn't mean anything that I don't know.
We're news website based in Minneapolis. I'm based in Washington. In Boston.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I can also see it. I'm curious about the whole resistance or whatever kind of movement that is.